I want to thank Craftsy for sponsoring today's video. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches, and today I'm going to recreate my very first quilt. My first quilt was a simple chevron quilt, and I've learned so much since I made that quilt. I'm going to recreate it with you today, and yes, there's a free downloadable pattern that you can grab in the description of this video. I'm going to show you how to make this super beginner-friendly quilt and talk about some of the mistakes I originally made and what I would do different now. All you need to make this quilt is 2 charm packs, so grab your fabric and let's get started. I'm using 2 charm packs to make this quilt. One has a print and one is plain white, but you can also use yardage for that background plain white fabric. I'm going to be using a 4.5-inch square ruler, and then you'll need one larger ruler to mark diagonally along your half square triangles. You'll also need a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, a matching thread. I like to use the color Dove by Aurifil. Some sort of marking utensil, and pins are helpful. Everything I'm using will be linked below. We'll need a total of 80 5-inch squares for this project. So each of these charm packs has 42 squares. So I'm going to remove 2 from the background plain white one and 2 from the print. And when you choose the ones to take out from the printed fabric, I usually recommend choosing ones that are as close to the background fabric as possible, just because you kind of lose the contrast with the chevron shape if you have too close of colors between your fabric A and your fabric B. Next, we're going to make our half square triangles, but before we do that, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video. When I made my first quilt, I spent hours piecing together all the information I needed to make it from start to finish. I knew the basics, but finding clear step-by-step instructions all in one place would have saved me so much time. That's exactly what Craftsy offers. I'm excited to share that Craftsy is sponsoring today's video. Craftsy is your go-to online resource for all things creative, with over 2,000 classes covering quilting, sewing, knitting, crochet, and more. Whether you're a total beginner or an experienced maker, there's always something new to learn. One class I highly recommend for beginner quilters is Amy Gibson's Learn to Quilt class. She breaks everything down step by step, making the whole process feel easy and approachable. But that's just the start. There are also classes on quilting with pre-cuts, free motion quilting, and making your own quilted bags, which I'm personally excited to try next. If you've been wanting to try Craftsy, now is the perfect time. Craftsy is offering new members an amazing deal. Right now, the first 1,000 of you to click the link in my description will get access to a full year of Craftsy Premium for just $1.49. If you're ready to hone in on your crafting skills or take your quilting skills to the next level, this deal is perfect for you. So click the link below and join Craftsy today. Now it's time to assemble our half square triangles. So we're going to use our fabric A squares and B squares, pair them together to make our contrasting half square triangles. This is very simple, but can be a little tricky as a beginner, so I'm going to show you all of my tips along the way. The first thing we're going to do is draw a diagonal line on the back of one of our squares. I like to use my lighter fabric, which is the background fabric in this case. And then we're going to pair the squares together, right sides together, meaning the pretty fabric will touch the pretty fabric. The good thing about using 2 charm packs from the same line is that they'll match together perfectly. So if you're going to use 2 charm packs, I definitely recommend getting them from the same fabric manufacturer. We'll sew a 1/4 inch away on either side of that marked line, and then we're going to cut the square in half along the diagonal along that marked line that we made earlier. This will give us 2 identical half square triangles out of those 2 squares. Next, it's time to press. So we're going to press towards the darker fabric just so that seam allowance gets hidden. Otherwise, it can show through the front. And then the last step is trimming. And this is arguably the most important step of making half square triangles. You'll want to make sure that diagonal line of your ruler is lined up exactly with the diagonal of your half square triangle. And then you're going to trim it down to 4.5 inches. And this is where a 4.5-inch square ruler is helpful, but you can definitely use any ruler you have as long as it has a diagonal line and a 4.5 mark. So I'm going to repeat that process for the other side to get a perfectly square 4.5-inch half square triangle. and you'll know if your half square triangle is trimmed correctly if it's 2 sides and then the diagonals are exactly in the corners of your half square triangle unit. We're going to repeat that process for all of our 5-inch squares to get 80 half square triangles. And I'm going to show you a few tools that are not required but are helpful to make this process go a little bit quicker. This thread cutter is amazing because you can chain piece all of your half square triangles together and then cut them like this. It just makes it go super quick. I also like using a block lock ruler when I am trimming my half square triangles, and I'll do a demonstration on that. It's also helpful to have a rotating mat or just a small mat like this that you can manually rotate on top of your cutting mat. So I'm going to show you how to use a 4.5-inch block lock ruler to trim down these half square triangles. I'm going to put my half square triangle on that mat, and then I'm going to place my block lock ruler on top. And the block lock ruler has a little shelf on it, so it fits in perfectly when you press your half square triangle to the side. It just butts up exactly right on your fabric, so that diagonal line will always be lined up. And then I'm going to trim 2 sides just like we did before. And then instead of moving anything, I'm just going to rotate that smaller mat, so then I don't have to spend the time, rearranging the ruler again, and it just makes it go a lot quicker, especially when you're doing 80 of these like we are in this pattern. And here are all of our half square triangles after they're pieced and trimmed to size. I have them laid out kind of by color so that I can make sure I get a nice scrappy look for this chevron quilt. So all I'm going to do here is just pull from each of these piles to make it nice and scrappy, and I'm going to lay it out in our pattern. So the one thing I do recommend doing is not having a really light fabric on the outer edges if you can help it. Just helps frame the pattern a little bit nicer, and I like to save those lighter colors for the middle of the quilt. That's just personal preference. You can obviously do it however you like. And this is what our chevron will look like. So you can see it gives us this nice chevron look. All you have to do is rotate the half square triangles to match the pattern. And what we're going to do is repeat this till we lay out our whole quilt, make sure it looks nice, and then we're going to sew it row by row. This is what the rows look like after they're sewn together. And we're going to press them in opposite directions to make sure that everything nests nicely. One thing you'll want to pay attention to is making sure that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance at those points where your half square triangles meet, and that will help eliminate any lost points in your chevron shape. That's definitely something I did not pay attention to with my first quilt, and if losing points is important to you, you'll want to pay attention to that. So we're going to sew all of these rows together to make our full quilt top. And this is what my fully pieced quilt top looks like. And you can see there are still some imperfections. I'm definitely not a precision quilter. If you've been here a while, you know that. But I would say this is a big improvement from my original quilt. I'm going to show you a little close-up of what that quilt looked like. Here is my first quilt, and you can see those intersections are not very clean. They overlap and aren't lined up, and that's due to the fact that I did not have a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance, and my trimming was not precise at all. But you can see here on the quilt I just made, I still have some points that don't line up, and I don't mind that. And lastly, let's talk about how I would quilt this. So my original quilt, I did what's called matchstick quilting, and I did that in the background fabric. So it was a lot of little lines, and it was very, very challenging. I had to pivot with that chevron shape, which was hard for my first quilt. And I used a thread that matched the front but did not match the back, which I would definitely not recommend if you're not an experienced quilter. I would use something that matches both, or choose a backing that matches the front a little bit closer. So now let's talk about what I would do to quilt this if this was my completely first quilt. So what I would do is maybe follow the chevron lines, but not do the matchstick quilting. Another option would be to do kind of a hatch, so all diagonal one way and all diagonal another way, lining up with that chevron shape. But my favorite way to quilt for a complete beginner is just organic wavy lines. You don't have to think about it too hard, and there's not really a way to mess it up. So that's always my go-to suggestion. If you want to play around with some more half square triangle designs like the chevron, you can check out this video here to explore what your next quilt will be. I'll see you there.